Welcome to the August 25th live Q&A. We're going to talk about the new 2023 updates to the I-9 form. We'll talk a little bit about some of the changes with how you can have the I-9 forms reviewed properly when you have remote employees, because that kept changing, and I don't think they're done making changes to that, but we'll at least talk about what the process is right now. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we'll just start talking about what an I-9 is, first of all, and then we'll talk about the form and some changes and stuff like that. All right. So an I-9 is an employment eligibility verification, and employers and employees must complete their respective sections of the form I-9, because the I-9 is used to document verification of identity and employment authorization for each new employee, both U.S. citizen and non-citizen, hired after November 6, 1986 to work in the U.S. And it's also used in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The employers must complete the I-9 to document the verification of the identity of the employment authorization of each new employee. And this started after November 27, 2011. It defines an employer, or the employer is the person or entity hiring an agent or someone acting directly or indirectly in the interest that engages in the service or labor of an employee to be performed in the U.S. for wages. Why can't they just put that in plain English? An employer is somebody who hires other people to do jobs and pays them a wage. An employee is a person who performs the service for an employer in exchange for wages or other remuneration. Authorized representative is, and this is I'm going to spend a little bit of time on authorized representative, because this is the part where a lot of the changes happen. It's any person an employer designates to complete and sign a Form I-9 on the employer's behalf. Employers are liable for any statutory or regulatory violations made in connection with the form or the verification process, including any violations committed by any individual designated to act on the employer's behalf. So with the remote employees, it used to be able to be where the employee would say, yeah, here's my verification forms, and just show them on camera. But that's not allowed anymore. They need to physically be looked at, and someone acting as an authorized representative of the employer then needs to complete the employer section of the I-9, and we'll talk more about this part later. And there can be, I haven't seen any, but I know a lot of people here, or some people here might have seen I-9 that was created by a preparer or a translator, and that is usually when the person isn't able to fill out an I-9 for themselves for a variety of different reasons. So I'm not going to keep reading the instructions. I know you've seen my YouTube channel. I just sit here and I read all the instructions, but I'm going to jump right into the form and just talk about the changes on the form itself. Um, so section 1 has pretty much stayed the same, where it asks for the employee information, the name, the address, their date of birth, social security number, email address, phone number, and then they attest that they are one of 4 different options: a citizen of the United States, a non-citizen or national of the United States, a lawful permanent resident, and then they have to enter their USCIS or A number, and a non-citizen other than item 2 and 3 above, authorized to work. And then they put the expiration date of their um, work authorization. And then if number 4, if item number 4 was checked, then they have to fill out their USCIS A number or their form I-94 admission number or their foreign passport number and country of issuance. And these are all or. So if they just fill in one of the boxes, they're good. If they fill out none of the boxes and check box 4, then the I-9 is not valid and needs to be sent back. And then they sign it and date it. And then I like that the employer review section is back on page 1. I never liked it when it was on page 2, and some people, if they're new to payroll, they're like, what do you mean? It used to be on page 1? Yeah, it did. And because it I like it because everything that you need for that employee is all right here, all in one place. And so the employer review, and this is the part that changed, and their the signature of employer or authorized representative and the name and title of authorized representative is probably, I think, one of the biggest changes that happened on who that is, um, because it can be the spouse or a relative or a friend of your remote employee, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the anybody who actually works for the company. Can be the authorized representative. And the but my preference would still be to go to a I-9 verification site. There there is a fee for it, but then you at least know that somebody who knows how to look and fill out the I-9 is the one that is looking at the documents and filling out the I-9. The list of acceptable documents that go in list A or list B and C have not changed. And then if the list of acceptable receipts, I don't think has changed. I very rarely have anybody that submits a receipt, but always, if you have a receipt for a replacement of a lost or stolen or damaged document, as soon as that gets replaced, it's always been our policy to have our employers ask their employees to submit that the replaced document to verify that it is valid. Um, and then the supplement A is for the preparer and or translator certification for section 1. And this part on the most recent version of the I-9, this was what was on the rest of page 1. And then there's a supplement B, which is the re-verification and rehire, which used to be section 3 of the I-9. And again, this used to just be a little piece on the form, and now it's an entire page because it does now 3 re-verifications instead of 1. And that is the 4 pages of the new I-9 verification. So I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has any questions. I'm not seeing any in the Facebook group.
Shannon, are these documents, is this updated I-9 available in the payroll programs for onboarding? Like, how is it handled through payroll programs like Gusto and ADP and QBO? Or is this something that has to happen outside of the programs that the employers should do?
I don't use ADP or Gusto for running regular payroll, but I believe that they have been working at updating it since this was released on August 1st. And it should, like, all of that stuff, if it was in the payroll software before, it should be in the payroll software again. But where a lot of people get tripped up is the filling out and how to handle the remote employees, like because I think, and judging from personal experience and seeing all the restorations and payroll reconstructions that we have to do, there's a lot of blank I-9 if an I-9 even gets filled out.
Yeah.
So what has been your experience, Deb, when working with Gusto and ADP and the other payroll platforms?
My experience with onboarding employees is that it has to happen I don't know what they do for remote employees. It's kind of been done already by the time I've been involved.
Right.
Lately. So in-house where they're looking physically at the documents. And that's certainly how it was in a prior time when I worked for a company. But I don't know what people do for remote employees. And I don't know if part of the onboarding is this self-serve. Do you fill that out and then you have a Zoom with your employer and be like, here's my ID?
Well, that was how you could do it starting at the beginning of COVID. You would do the Zoom and go, here's my documents. And then somebody was just looking at it over the screen, but they did go back. I forget the exact date, but it was June or July, because again, this isn't something that I handle for my clients either, but that it did go back to saying that everybody who was hired remote and still works for you, if their documents were not physically verified, they had to be physically verified. And I believe they keep extending that because a lot of people are confused and don't know how they can get the documents physically verified. And that is definitely not my strong area of knowledge when it comes to this, but it is where a lot of the questions are. I do know from hanging out in a lot of different HR groups that the that they are allowing non-employees and people outside of the people who normally would remotely physically verify for remote workers, because even before COVID, a remote worker was a thing. We just forget that people were remotely working for so long before COVID hit. And I remember the I-9 and the E-Verify trainings that I took at the beginning of COVID. They were really promoting the places that do the remote verification, because it's an office you go to, you hand somebody your documents, you hand them the I-9 that you completed, they physically review the documents, they keep the I-9 and give you back your documents, and then that I-9 gets processed and mailed to the employer. And that was a thing before COVID. And I didn't know it existed until COVID. So, it's just what is the new process? Because
Right.
with the allowing people to not to remotely and not physically verify the documents, I think people got lazy, because
Yeah.
even if you had the ability to physically work with your, or like, people would be at home and on a day that they weren't in the office and say, here's my documents, instead of bringing them into the office to and say, here's my documents. And it
And they can't, you're also saying with this whole thing that you can't scan an image and send
no
it securely? Okay.
but it's always had to be. So the rules with I-9s always were that the documents had to physically be verified. They couldn't be
Images.
remotely or a photocopy. So you couldn't make a photocopy at home and bring that photocopy into the office and say, here's my documents, because there's no way to physically verify them if all you have is the image. But that was allowed during COVID.
I feel like a lot of people do that just unknowingly, like just scan me a picture of your license and
Right.
yeah. Or a
Yeah.
PDF, whatever, an image.
Right. And, as far as the physical verification of the documents, it seems like it's gone a little bit backward, because there's, and for me, there is I think it's more for the people who don't have one of the remote physical verification offices nearby. There's one in every major city. I live, 80 miles from Minneapolis, and I it's been a little while since I've looked at that map, but I think the closest remote verification facility was 20 miles away, which here we don't have a problem saying, go to this other town and do this. But I think there are some parts of the country where there isn't a physical verification office within a day's drive. So having the ability to say, hey, Deb, can you have your cousin physically verify your documents and sign the I-9, work in those situations. And it depends on if E-Verify is required as to what you have to do in order to physically verify the documents.
Yeah. Are they going to go more to E-Verify for everybody and just have, or is that still
That's
just
the way
like
it's looking.
government jobs? Yeah.
Well, or even, and sometimes even, I've seen it where it's a pretty tenuous grasp on government job where, oh, and Deborah just put something in the comments that I got distracted by. Um, but I've seen it where if somebody is hiring and they could possibly have a government contract in the future, that they
Mm,
have to e-verify all of their employees before they can even apply for any government funding or take on a government contract.
yeah,
So, and Deborah Washington put in the comments that unless you're a certified document examiner, physically inspecting identification documents doesn't guarantee that they're legit. Some forgeries are believable.
100%.
Totally. And, you know, and how many people in HR are a certified document examiner,
Right.
you know? Because I
I've
don't,
seen really good social security cards
yeah,
that were not e-verified. You know, you get those documents on the front end
yep,
and then you run it through e-verify and they don't pass initially.
right, right. And then, there's so many different variations of a social security card, depending,
Yeah.
like I still have the first one I got when I was, well, I was 1.5 when I got my social security number, because they didn't do it in the hospital
Yeah.
anymore, or back then mine came from the post office. But, and I forget what year it was, but they quit doing the digits of your social security number
Yeah.
by region. And so that can be confusing. And I I will bet that there are so many people that are high business owners that are handling processing the documents themselves, that they don't know what a valid, because ITINs, there's a lot of different payroll platforms that will let you put in a ITIN, which are valid for filing an income tax return, but not valid for W-2 employment.
Mm,
So, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but it was probably 12 or 13 years ago. I didn't even know what an ITIN was. And I've been processing payroll since 2003.
mm,
And I didn't know what an ITIN was. I It wasn't until I did training on income tax and decided I really didn't want to have anything to do with income tax ever, that I learned what an ITIN was. So it's totally within the realm of believability that a regular business owner isn't going to know that
mhm.
an ITIN isn't valid for for employment. I've had um, consultations with other professionals that their legal resident alien client was sold an S corp, and they don't have a social security number, they have an ITIN. Well, that causes issues with the reasonable compensation. I
Right.
don't know what all the rules are around that. So, because there's a lot of stuff that borders on legal advice versus knowing and understanding payroll rules. And like, I think the only other thing that I didn't say on this that I wanted to make sure got mentioned is that by November 1st, if you are hiring or working with clients that are hiring employees and you're filling out an I-9, you are required to use the new I-9 by November 1st. If you don't and you get an I-9 audit, there's significant penalties for each wrong form that you had somebody fill out.
So that's just for new employees. They don't, are
For
they
new.
making, okay, they're not making people go back and fill out a new one.
No, not if they have continuous employment, but if they have gaps in their employment, then they need the rehire verification, which I believe does require the new form.
Okay.
Does Doreen, Deborah, Susan, do you guys have questions that we haven't talked about? Any burning thing that you came here to learn that you want that I maybe haven't covered yet? All right. Well, thank you guys for hopping in. We'll see you guys all again next time.